Here we go.
Very well. We see your presentation now.
We all have to learn new tricks, and there are lots of tricks. So, just, like I say, I thank you all for being here. This is part of the Fish Foundation Spaceship Institute, and in cooperation with the North American team. I do have to read this disclaimer as part of this. Please bear with me. The information and educational material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANs processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for healthcare professionals' clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided as is and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves, for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to. Part of the North American Corona team, welcome to the United States. Part of the North American Corona team, welcome to Mexico. One moment.
And Alex and Ed are the only ones recording, it appears. So Joseph, would you or Ed please remember to put the meeting into the American Corona team? For some reason, I am not recording.
I need to have permission to record again. I got kicked out and had to log back in.
All right, Joseph will have the full recording.
Yes, and I will put it in if nobody says we should not do it, because there was one case, and Ed, you have the opportunity to record. And if somebody needs to record, please just raise your hand, then I see it, and then I give you the...
Okay, I would like to record. If you can allow me to record.
You have the right to record. I have given it to you already, so just hit the button, please.
It's not allowing me to record, but that's fine.
More challenges.
Please try again. I have given it again to you.
I got a message on the screen. It allows me to record, but it's not recording. I'm going under my name and pressing it. It's not recording. That's fine. No problem.
Okay, then
we have two recordings going now, and a third will be Ed.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute. This is a class on plasma science. We were doing basic classes. This is a basic understanding. We call it the Y-axis. My name is Alexander from Canada. It is April the 4th, 2021. This is part of the Keshe Foundation Canada Plasma Education Series. We have already in the can 9 basic classes, 6 intermediate classes, 6 advanced classes. These are all part of the basic 21 sets of basic understanding, which is condensation. That's over 3,000 hours of archives. We try to narrow it down to under 40 hours of teaching. Very intensive. I understand all of you as new knowledge seekers, take as much as you can. Experienced knowledge seekers, add to the knowledge. Teachers, please add to the knowledge. And we want to continue with basic understanding. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the x-axis, which featured rotation. Today, we're going to talk about the y-axis, and we'll see what it means. When we were talking about the plasma science, we have to have terminology. And so what is my hope is we've gone through all of these terminologies. We want to use them in context. We want to use them so that we can actually communicate with our thoughts, ideas, and our innovations, and have a cohesive discussion. And then we have to add more terminology, which is very, very specific to the plasma science, so that involves definitions of principal matter, amino acids, star formations, plasma state, which we talked about rotation, and dynamic plasma state, which now involves non-tangibility. And how do we get there? Well, there are fields that are affecting. And so we want to just talk about a bridge between the old science and the new science. And we're using transmission, transition, and transmutation as a bridge to that. So I think everybody can understand the X, the Y, and the Z axis. And the X axis involves rotation. The Y axis involves polarity. And the Z axis involves field strength. Today, we're going to talk about how the polarity advance, shall we say, on the polarity subject. Plasma starts at the core and is always looking to position. And when we say position, position to what? And so there's an interaction of fields. And so this positioning has to do with other fields and how they work together. So energy is always in motion between these various fields, and the direction of the energy is the charge. So the charge is the energy in motion. It goes through various geometries. We have them in the basics, in the physicality, in the X, Y, and Z axis. But when we get into the other dimensions, what we call the soul dimensions, then we start to involve with other types of references. We have references of creation, co-creation, procreation. This involves our emotions. And so these all, we have to have a context of ranges and how we can go between these ranges and how we can transcend the various dimensions to achieve what we want to achieve. So fundamentally, this all has to do with the books of Mr. Kesh, book number 1, The Universal Order, The Creation of Matters. And we understand that energy is always in motion. That's what the universe exists from. And to have energy in motion, it has to have a charge. So energy is a charge in motion, and it is always in motion, and there's always a giving and taking. One of the difficulties is to understand the difference between the old science and the new science, and that involves matter. And so we have the physical matter, which is manifests of energy. And so to manifest this energy, we have to bind this energy together. And when we bind it, we are part of the creation. So the manifestation is actually binding and creation. The binding is the creation. And so are we going to bind it in a physical state, or are we going to bind it in a plasmatic state? And there is a difference. And the way that we communicate in that difference is through light matter, the matter that flows. And it flows, first of all, it has to have a core component. We said the plasma has to have a position, a central position. This is generally the neutron, which we consider the gravitational aspect of it. And then from there, we have the force field interaction, which we bring in the antimatter, dark matter, and the matter, which we call the principal matter, transition or transmission matter, or the light matter. Today, we're going to talk about the transition or transmission matter. When we say transmission, we refer to rotation. When we say transition, it goes through the poles. So, but there is a commonality there. And so it's going from here to there. And whatever it goes from here to there, it maintains a balanced position. And anytime you maintain a balance between the here and the there, the giving and the taking, the magnetical gravitational, we call that a mag-grav condition. And so the energy is traveling through space, and when it sees a commonality and it creates a force field interaction, this is the beginning of creation, and the creation becomes a balance point, which we call a mag-grav. But we have to figure out what is our particular point of view. And generally speaking, our point of view is an earthbound condition. And so we have been looking from a scientific standpoint from our physical condition only. And we fail to understand that we are plasmatic beings. And as plasmatic beings, our essence comes from our soul. And it is from our soul that we come down to the physical, which is the visible reality. There is an in-between. We talked about transmission, which goes along the x-axis. But now we're going to today talk about the transition. How do we transition from the physical to the soul? How do we transition from the soul to the physical? How do we transition from magnetical to gravitational, or from magnetical, and from gravitational to magnetical, excuse me? What we're talking about is the relationship within the range on this planet is between the ground and the sky. But there's more to this universe than meets the eye. And so we talked about forces coming together, and we weren't specific about where these forces came, because these forces are not visible to the naked eye. And initially, when they come together, they do their little dance. And so we created a rotating field, and we made the x-axis. But as the energy came together, we added the y-axis. So now we have 2 dimensions. And we see that the energy can rotate and come in and go around, but we don't know which direction it goes. And so that is determined by the positioning. There are a lot of factors that come into this on how the energy is performing, but the energy itself is in a package. And so it is a parceling unit. And that parceling unit carries a charge, and that charge indicates direction. That direction is dependent on the environment and on the position. And so when we have a mag-grav condition, that has caused some kind of environmental attraction, and it creates a rotating field. And that field, that plasmatic field, precedes the physical field. So again, what we're looking at is not visible by the naked eye, but what's going on in there. So we talked about field rotation. When the energy comes in, it doesn't slow down, it doesn't stop. Energy is always in motion. How do you contain that energy? It has to go through a rotating field. And how many rotating fields? Well, I don't know. How big is large? There's a lot of factors that come into it. But one of the things that we do know with the plasma is that it is not restricted to the physical field. In other words, when it becomes dynamic, it can not only transcend to the outer layers, but go beyond the boundaries. And so this is the essence of the plasma science. And so when we start to dabble with this, and for a lot of people, this becomes really important, because we want to have some kind of anchorage to our physicality, something that we can touch and feel. So we had reactors that were actually physical, and we put GANs inside, and we created a rotating field. We did that with electric motors. And these electric motors created a rotating field. That was the x-axis, and that field was a plasmatic condition. But we found that when they all got working together, that they created the dynamic plasma condition. And so 4 rotating reactors in the star formation actually created the 5th dynamic plasma state. And what is interesting is that within this plasma state, within this range, on this planet, within this physical planet, which we call home, we were able to see the matter state, which is the actual rotating spheres, the GAN state, which is the actual GANs that we put inside the rotating spheres. the plasma state, which is the field that was manifest from the rotation, and the dynamic plasma state, which was manifest from the combination of the interaction of the fields. And so we see two physical energy states, two non-physical energy states within the same range. So therefore, we are able to have a physical and a non-physical energy state on this planet. So we don't have to go into outer space to achieve a non-physical state. We can do this right here at home. And so what is novel about this is that we can take this dynamic plasma state into outer space. But think about this. If we can have a physical and a non-physical state within the range on this planet, then why can't we have a physical and a non-physical range in outer space? And so how do we do this? Well, one of the ways is the transition energy between the gravitational and magnetic forces. And these plasma forces are a two-way street. And so when we're looking at the dynamic field forces, that when they come together, we have the principal matter, the transition matter, and the matter, whether it's plasmatic or physical. And then we create a force field and a star formation. And then they interact with other force fields and star formations. So these force fields are moving back and forth. And are they end-to-end or head-to-head, or how are they linked up? And so this is a transition of energy through the poles. It all depends on the orientation of the poles. And the same thing happens. So we talked about the dimensions, the various dimensions. So now we know that we can have various dimensions on this planet. We can go through these different dimensions on this planet, where we go from the physical environment of the Earth through our own physicality through into a dynamic plasma condition, and then we can actually transcend into an interactive field. And so this becomes the discussion, how do we transition between these various ranges? And so we understand that we have to look at the various relationships. So we, as plasma beings, have a relationship between a balance between the magnetical gravitational field. So we are a maggrav. So that's the first revelation. The second revelation is that our understanding of the way the universe operates and how the universe is created is not only a scientific discovery, but it is a spiritual discovery. And so we know that these two have been almost adversarial. This has to change. We are going to add the scientific and the spiritual together and advance the knowledge into the plasma state. So basically, to understand how fields react, we did transmission. And so we did a straight line transmission. And in order to have these fields attract to each other, they have to have opposite poles. So the poles are the transition. So to allow this to continue and to be linked up, we have these three round magnets in physicality linked up together. And we see there's no gap in between, but there is a field force in between that is holding them together. And so this is the binding energy between the negative and the positive charge. And we also know that if we were to bring in another magnet, that it would interact with this field somehow and make a change. And we cannot see that interacting field, but we can definitely feel it. So we acknowledge that it's there. So all what we have to understand is that this phenomenon, which happens in physicality, also happens in the plasma reality. And so we find, if we had a microscope and we could look at our fundamental structure, which is our DNA, and the DNA comes after the amino acids are created. The DNA is a product of the physical manifestation on this planet. So the DNA is basically the transmission of energy along the x-axis. It involves a rotation. It is something that is manifest after we're born. The y-axis is the RNA, this manifesting before we were born. This is one of the reasons we can't remember what we were born from, but we do know that we were born. So a lot of people are still asking the question, why? And I'll keep saying, you're asking the wrong question. Why is not the question, why is the answer? We were born. We have an RNA, we have a DNA. What is causing these components to interact? And so when we're looking at the DNA and RNA, we're only looking at two of the components. And the RNA is working on the y-axis. But what is the significance of this? So when we talked about transmission, which is along the x-axis, we are actually talking about the DNA transcription. And we find that this is significantly connected to our consciousness. And the question arises is, how can someone who is in a coma remain alive? They're basically, according to us, they're brain dead, but they are actually unconscious. So somehow that unconsciousness is maintaining a consciousness. It's not necessarily maintaining a memory. So that an unconscious person, someone in a coma, may not remember the period of the coma, but they will remember before they entered the coma, and they will remember after they left the coma. So we see that the transmission of energy or the transmission of information is very much in a conscious state. So the transition of energy from the unconscious to the conscious is through a different format. And so we find that when we look at what the effect is of the blood serum pH, we find that we understand that above 7 is alkaline, below 7 is acidic, the midpoint is 7 for water, the midpoint for blood is 7.46. And so when the blood starts to become more acidic with a relationship to the blood, it may drop down to 7.3. We're not dealing in specific numbers here. We're just giving generalities and trends. So we are basically taking the blood serum and going into an acidic direction. However, at 7.3, with respect to water, it is considered alkaline. But 7.3 with respect to blood is considered acidic. And what happens to the DNA? Well, it actually begins to stretch. And if it drops down again, say to 7.2, it stretches again. And then if it goes to, well, if we get into the coroner's office, the DNA is flat. And so what we're seeing is that the distance and the range of the DNA is affecting the communicability of the information. And so the DNA is carrying a communication, an imprint, if you will, of our physicality. And so what we've been saying is that the DNA is the same in our thumbs, in both thumbs, but our thumbs are opposing. So therefore, the transcription information of our physicality is not really dependent on our DNA. It's interpreted by our DNA, but it's not the cause and effect. The same way as when you were born, your DNA was not what you were born with. You came here somehow, some connection, you transited to this planet, and so the RNA transcription becomes the transition of your unconsciousness. And the unconsciousness we refer to in spirituality as your karma, or you carry forward. And this is perpendicular to your DNA. So we know what perpendicular means. It's 90 degrees of a relationship. So the DNA RNA interaction is perpendicular to each other. And so in modern science, we're looking for gene therapies, if you will. And we have engaged in gene modification, if you will. Personally, I call it gene mutilation. But what we found with the plasma science is that we can have a restoration of the genes to their original source. So the main gene modification that we're engaging with today is mainly on the RNA side, because the RNA affects the DNA and they work together. And then what happens in our society, seeing as these are linked up, and so we say in a healthy blood serum pH, we see that the range between the interactions of the DNA is at a prescribed rate, and the interactions of the RNA are at a prescribed rate, and the combination of the interaction of the RNA and the DNA is at a prescribed rate. But when we change the pH, we call that terrain altering. And in our society, there are various factors which affect and create acidity within our blood. So the four basics are air pollution, water pollution, food pollution, and the worst of all is the mental pollution. And then what happens when our blood becomes acidic, we find that our DNA extends. And if our DNA is extending and the RNA is interlinking with that, then the RNA is also extending. And so we find that we're having issues. This information is traveling in both directions. This is one of the things about the plasma science, which is unique. Energy is not only in motion, but it's a two-way street. So we have to understand that that energy is going between two plasma fields, and it's going back and forth. But in order for each plasma field to maintain its magnetical gravitational balance point, which we call a maggrav, it has to also give and take to itself. So in essence, it has to be self-serving to maintain its maggrav position, but it also has to be serving others to maintain its plasmatic interaction. So you cannot not maintain a plasmatic interaction. Energy is always in motion. You just can't dictate where you're going to give this energy to, because that energy, what creates the definition of that energy is the field strength and the barrier of fields, which is through natural selection. And that choice you have. So you are what you give your time and energy to. And so that's the basis of that. That is not only science, but that is also spirituality. What I want to talk about is, we brought up the subject of growth, and we said that it has to do with hydration. And you're not looking at viruses here, you're looking at a concrete gel envelope. And so a concrete particle, when you add water to concrete, you understand it goes through a chemical process and then it eventually becomes hard. So what actually is happening is that the water is coming in from the outside and hydrating the cement particle. And it basically does create a, shall we say, an encompassing field or a corona type field. And it gravitates, shall we say, towards the core. And so in the process, the water itself is consumed. So we understand, remember from the water molecule, that the hydrogen leaves and the hydroxyl combines. Well, what happens to the hydroxyl? It combines with the silicon in the concrete and forms a SiO4, which is the basic structural formation of concrete. Right? And that would be on a chemical basis. But an interesting thing happens is that these little spikes grow. And these little spikes that grow out grow away from, in other words, they grow in the magnetical direction, away from the core. And the way they grow is through a rotation. So we have the basic core, which is manifesting from a field rotation. And then we have these spikes, which are growing away from this core in a field rotation. So we now have two rotations operating in two different directions. We said the x-axis is a rotating field, and these spikes are going in a polar field. And so to maintain the mag-grav condition of the polar field, we have a rotating field to maintain that field. So we're literally having, through the polar field, a rotating field within the polar field. Why I'm bringing this up is because when we look at this snail, and I swear to God, I mean, this is my snail, and he hasn't gone through the Fish Foundation Spaceship Institute classes. It's done this all on its own. And what it has done, it has created from its core, its basic soul at the smallest part, a rotating field. And it has built up this shell. But as it's gone through this buildup, and you can see the striations going across it, that has been a rotating field as well. So the way that this rotation has extended is through an individual rotation. So this is the same thing that happens when our Earth rotates. One rotation is a day. And if we do this 365 days in a row, we actually traverse around the sun. Are we back at the same point 1 year later? No, because the entire solar system is moving with relationship to the rest of it. And so this is how you find this shift in this shell. In this shell, you see that it started as a small, rotated, and through the process of growth, it rotated and it created a field. Unfortunately, this field is big enough to house the snail because the snail itself is growing. So there has to be a coordination to the rate of growth of the snail and the rate of growth of the snail shell, right? Because the snail shell has to be big enough to accommodate the snail. Okay, well, that's very interesting. So we have the basis of the creation. That's the rotating field. We find that our nerves are doing the same thing, but there's something different about the nerves. They basically form, each of these little individual green squares is part of the myelin sheath on a nerve. So we have the nerve with the head on the left, which is the neuron, and a synaptic gap on the right, which is part of the dendrites. And isn't it interesting that we have dendrites, and in between the dendrites, we have a gap, kind of like your monatomic nanocoating. And we find that these myelin sheets actually grow, and they create a growth through rotation. But as this rotation is growing on the leading edge, there is an addition of material, and that material is also created through a rotation. So we have a rotation within a rotation. Okay. What I want to talk about today is we have a seashell, and we understand that we have a rotation to make the shell because the seashell is made the same way as the snail shell. This particular seashell has spikes on it, kind of like the concrete gel has spikes on it. And so these spikes are actually growing perpendicular to the original field rotation. And frankly, we don't build houses this way, do we? Our houses are basically square, X, Y, and Z. But we're looking at nature and how it builds this house. So not only do we have a rotation, but we have spikes in the rotation. And these spikes, as you can see, are thicker at the base and thinner at the top. So the direction of energy flow is towards the magnetical. So they are going from the base to the top. So each one of these spikes is following a plasmatic star formation and is manifesting into the physicality. Now, I've never personally watched how the creature that lives in this shell, how it does this. But we know that to create the basis, it does that by going around and following a rotating field. And so, how does it know to do that? Who was the teacher? Did it see it on YouTube? I'm just wondering, how does the creature that built this get to be so smart to be able to do this? And challenge yourself. You try and do this. See how long it takes. Maybe you can make a cake that looks like this. I don't know. We'll see if the spikes stay, and let's see if they become rigid, and let's see if they become functional. I'm just saying that Mother Nature is showing us that the creation of this physicality comes from a source. It doesn't come from this physicality. It manifests into this physicality. It comes from a plasma reality. And that plasma reality comes here based on the environment. It is only when we get into this environment that we can begin to manifest this reality. This is the reality that we have to come to. So when we look at what constitutes soul growth, we see that there are two aspects to it. There's an unconsciousness and a consciousness. So if you're not aware, then how can you be conscious? And if you are conscious, would you accept it? And so this is part of knowing and learning. And so we say this is also part of the awakening. But once you know something, what difference does it make? Like, is it really going to make any difference to your life? And you find that that is part of the process of maturing. So the reason that everybody has made the supreme effort to come in here into this meeting today is because we recognize how important the subject is, and we would all like to know what is the source of our creation. So we know that we grow. We have an awareness to that. We have a sensitivity to that, and our science tells us that we are carbon-based, in other words, organic. We understand that our planet is silicon-based, in other words, inorganic. And we understand that whenever we have a MAGRAF condition, you cannot have a MAGRAF condition without having a soul. And so we find that the limitations that we have been imposed by the scientific limitations. And one of those sources is when we identify Planck's constant. The key word is constant. The mathematical equation and the waves and frequencies, these are not part of the process. What is part of the process is we are part of the process. We are not only the observers of this relationship, but you cannot be not a participant. You can only be a participant. The participant-observer relationship problem is a problem in the mind's eye of the scientific limitation. The participant observer is more than the same thing. In the plasma science, we have no limitations. So when we're looking at the limitations, we have to operate in a field reference. Okay, so we have to establish a relationship. So when we talked about the x-axis, we talked about only singularity, the transmission. I don't know what to call it. It's just called the holy moly. And then today we have the y-axis, which is going through the poles. And so that gives us a duality. And I don't know what to call that either, so I'll just call it the holy cow. And so we find that there's another dimension. And so all of this is based on relationships. And where do we fit in? We don't fit in any of these, okay? Because we are the participant observer to this relationship. So we are in a plasma state, which is higher. And this is the point. We are in a balanced maggrav condition where we have a balance of the magnetical gravitational fields. And so from a scientific standpoint, what we're looking at is the balance between the conservation of magnetical fields versus the conservation of energy, right? So you have a magnetical field, which is a balanced maggrav, and you have energy, which flows from field to field, from maggrav to maggrav. So spiritually speaking, we have a soul, and that soul is somehow connected. But just because you have a balanced position, and just because you have a soul, it doesn't mean you do anything with that knowledge. You could just be a nice bump on the log and enjoy your presence. But, you know, if you want to do something, you have to add some spirit to it. And so the spirit becomes the motor of the soul. And this is where the plasma science wishes to add to the knowledge base that we've achieved scientifically, the knowledge base that we've achieved spiritually. Add it together and add more. And you will find that 1 + 1 is more than 2. So we want to graduate from the perpendicular forces which are operating in the 3 dimensions. So far we've discussed the X and the Y axis. Next time we will discuss the Z axis. And this is all to maybe understand a little bit more advanced. This is our friend DINO KRASPEDON. And DINO here has figured out that God is a set of mutually perpendicular lines. And they are oscillating upon themselves. So that kind of implies a frequency. And if we look at the structure of these oscillating lines and the structure on the periodic table of elements, we find that these, I'm having a delay on the screen here. These lines are interacting because they want to travel. And so what we want to do is to travel from one corner diagonally to the other corner. And so if we take one dimension and we follow the x-axis, in order to get to the other corner, we have to make a couple of bends in the road. And these bends in the road are perpendicular to each other. So we can start at the x-axis, then we make a bend on the y-axis, and then we have to make a bend on the z-axis. But, you know, that's if we only go on the one road. What if we go on the other road? And what if we go on the y-axis? We have a choice. We can go rotation or we can go through the poles. But we find then if we want to continue on our path, we have to bend to the x-axis, and then we have to bend to the z-axis, and we get to that destination. But if we look at the individual path, we find that the paths on the x-axis and the path on the y-axis are different. And there's a reason for this, and we will discuss that later, because this picture is not complete. So we're going to discuss that later. But what I'd like to discuss is the fact that based on these interactions of fields, we have plasma positioning. And so we have a choice. If we look at the 6 faces of this cube, we can have plasmatic energies in the center of the face. If we look at the center of the cube, we can have a plasmatic condition, which we call body centering. We can have any combination of these that we wish. And so once we have a relationship with that particular dimension, we can reposition ourselves. And this is what we always have to do. And we know that because we see the same thing that happens with these magnets. So this time we have a circle of magnets and they have a polarity. Because it's round, it's an arbitrary polarity. I don't know which way is up. I just know that opposite poles attract. So some are negative, some are positive. So we can change this polarity by rotation Or we can change this polarity by flipping the poles. Indirectly, the result is the same. However, the travel could be through a different perpendicular field. That's the point. And so when we look at the Earth, we find that the Earth is actually round, yes, and it rotates around the x-axis, which is the equator. And then it has fields that go through the poles, which is the y-axis, and there's a magnetical gravitational relationship. And so this is the basic geometry. This is the basic geometry of the Earth, and the Earth has done quite a good job. And we are passengers on this Earth. And so we have to follow the rotation on this Earth. But we also have a rotation because we have a Magnetic condition. And the Magnetic condition is the balance of two forces coming together. We create an x-axis and a y-axis. And next time we'll talk about the z-axis. So what we're talking about is basically two fields interacting. And we look at the basic plasma rules. The higher strength feeds the weaker strength. And then the combination of those creates a magnetic balance field. And then that balance field gives. And the question is, gives to what? And then it also takes. And the takes question is, takes from where? Okay. The answer is why. So what we have to do is find out what is the question. So energy is always flowing. Energy is always in motion. And energy always has a charge. So in order to receive, we have to give. So the giving is first because we have to make room. Because if we don't make room, where are you going to put it, right? So you have to emit first, absorb second. And from which direction do you emit and which direction do you absorb? All directions. But when we look at the fundamental path of energy, we just say that the energy comes in and it goes out and it goes around. And if we don't have the right field strength, it'll just pass right through. So what determines this is the magnetical repulsion of forces, which we call emission, and the gravitational attraction of forces, which we call absorption. And so the balance field is between the ground and the sky, which we refer to as our equator and our magnetosphere. And that represents a certain direction of our field forces. And the way we travel within those field forces, which we call a range, is based on susceptibility. So now we know when we look at this picture, which is a picture that we can't see with the naked eye. We've talked about the x-axis, which is rotation, and the y-axis, which is the energy going through the poles. But as you can see, that doesn't complete the picture. That only completes what we're talking about today, and that is that this rotating field is not only rotating to keep the magnetical field, not only rotating to keep the gravitational field, but there are rotating fields in between, and we can transition through these fields by going from the core to the magnetical aspect of it. And what determines that, as I said, is susceptibility. So if we understand that this is all rotating, then when we take our dimension building and we have a point, in order to have a reference, we have to have a second point. So we add a second and we connect one. And then if we want to make our rotating field, you just grab one end of it and you swing the other one around. So we call the one end that's the pivot point and the other goes through an arc. And this is how the sun rotates around the planet. Yeah, the sun rotates around the earth. That's how we perceive it because that's our point of view. But in reality, the earth rotates and so the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west. But the thing that we do find is that in the morning and the evening, we are in the red zone, and in high noon, we are in the blue zone, which indicates a polar shift. And then at night, we are in neither one of those zones because we're in the dark. And so there is a transition that goes from the morning to the night, and in between, we have these zones. And we can transition to any level that we wish. So we see how the plants grow at different heights. Some plants grow under the ground. Some plants grow above the ground. Some plants grow really, really tall. And some of the really tall ones we call trees. And so when we look at the universe, we find that the universe is constructed the same way. And we see that you can take a sweep that goes from the left side to the right side. And that's what you do. You grab the one and you just swing it around. And then in between, you have these various rotating fields. And so the old science brought in ways and means of going through these ranges and transitioning. And so we understand now star formations and plasma fields. But when we look in the universe, we see a much different picture. We see the whole picture. So our point of view has to really, really change. Instead of looking at half the picture, instead of just looking at it from our point of view, let's look at it from a universal point of view, and we find that now it's a complete picture. It is a round picture, and it is many, many round pictures coming together. And there's an interaction of each of these fields, and each of these fields are rotating in different directions. And there's a reason for that. We're not going to talk about that today. But we are going to talk about is the manifestation of these fields. We can clearly see from this water hyacinth that it has flowers which are spiky, and there's like a set of 3 at the top. We have leaves that are kind of round. They're also a different color. And the roots are long and stringy, and they look like hair. And so we have physical manifestation of 3 different type of fields within this particular plant. And it has an above the water and it has the below the water physical manifestation. And so what we're saying, the manifestation of this physicality comes from the plasmatic manifestation, which had to come first. And so it transcends through its own various fields. And so this transition of fields is called field cutting. And so it cuts through rotational fields. And which way does it go? Well, we don't know. It goes both ways. And does it just go through the north and the south? Well, obviously not. It goes in various poles. So it's handy to say we have a north and south pole, because within our physical manifestation, the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west, which indicates the direction of rotation of the earth. But what about the plasmatic energy fields of the earth, the manifestation of the physicality? Why do we have copper in Chile and oil in the Middle East and gold in the Far East? Why is that? Because these are all the manifestations of the physical transition of these fields, you see, which comes from the original plasmatic orientation. And the plasmatic orientation comes from the interaction between the fields of the plasmatic fields and the environment. This interaction we call inertia. And so now we understand how we have come to this planet, and we have created our own spaceship. But this spaceship that we've created has a neck, arms, legs, and in some cases a tail. And then we also have a head on top of our neck. And so dependent on the polar orientation of the direction of flow, so whether it's magnetical gravitational, which means it's negative, or gravitational magnetical, which means it's positive, gives us the shape and dimensions of our physicality. Our physicality is determined by our plasmatic reality. So with that, we have to understand. And so when we're looking at our manifestation and how we do this on this planet, we find that we in the northern hemisphere are, right side up, and those in the southern hemisphere are upside down. And we wonder how they operate. Well, the reason is because from their point of view, they are right side up. So it isn't north and south as a competition. It has to do with field transition. And that field transition goes through a field rotation. And the relationship between this transition and this transmission is the physical manifestation. So the question really is the orientation, not why. Why is the answer. And so we find that the cups of life and how they're structured, and we find the interaction of these cups of life have the same thing. We can make the cups of life in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and we can create them in any direction that we want because they are based on the orientation. And so we find the resemblance between the stacker of the cups of life and our spine, and how the higher energy feeds the weaker energy, but there's no discrimination there. It always feeds to the lower energy. It is unconditional. And so we know that in a coma, we can have the maintenance of our body as a plasmatic condition, although it is unconscious. So therefore, there is some kind of energy that is maintaining that MAGRAV condition of unconsciousness. And so that is where our soul comes in. And our soul is also needs to maintain its MAGRAV condition. And when you say a MAGRAV condition, feeding to what? Taking from where? And so that is the question. And so we find that the reality, our reality, is actually a manifestation. When two fields come together, they form another. This other is the manifestation. So the plasma feeding leads to the manifestation. And now the new rules are that the manifestation could be either non-tangible or tangible, non-visible or visible, plasmatic or physical. So therefore, there is a plasmatic reality and there is a physical reality. There cannot be a physical reality without a plasmatic reality. But there can be a plasmatic reality without a physical reality, right? Because the manifestation is the form artifact. So we find that there is some kind of connection, whether it be through transmission or transition. And it's the emotion of presence, which is a form artifact of this energy that is in motion. And so fundamentally, really, really fundamentally, the plasma science is all about the magnetical attraction and repulsion. And so we create a magnetical field, and then we create a gravitational field, and the combination of those create a MAGRAV condition, and energy has to be always in motion, so the magnetical is giving, the gravitational is taking, and then we say giving to what and taking from where. And so this is how energy is always moving, and so now we understand the basis of the cups of life. And the reason for that is it's done the same way. There's a giving and taking of energy. So when we look inside cup number 1, we find that we have 2 matter state components, a zinc plate and a copper coil. We have a plasmatic component, a nano-coated copper coil in the center. And the combination of these fields creates a magnetical field. And we say that, and then it creates a gravitational field. And so when you're looking at the cup of light, you now know that there are interacting fields there which are not visible to the naked eye, but you know that they're there because they are plasmatically manifest. And then they physically manifest into a GANS, which we see in this particular configuration is zinc GANS and copper GANS. Now you've created another manifestation, and that will create CO2 GANS. And now we have created a basis of a star formation, and we bring in the amino acid and the construction of water. And so what we've gone through is 4 different levels here. We have physical state, we have nano, we have GANS, all part of the physical state. And then we also have a plasma condition at the center, and we have a dynamic plasma condition, which is the field that rotates. And when we look at the second cup, it's constructed the same way, with the difference of being a copper plate instead of a zinc plate. But the same thing happens. We have a magnetical field and we have a gravitational field. And then when we have the 2 cups together, we see that there's a difference. There's a difference in field strength. And there's a relationship of the interchange of energy within those components. Likewise, there's an interchange of energy between these two cups as well. So we like to say that we want to keep the batches apart at least 1 meter if we're trying to get exclusively an emotional cup and exclusively a physical cup. But when we put the two together, what we're really getting is the beginning of the cup of man, and we will talk about that later. But the most important subject on our minds today, and you know, for us Canadians here in the province of Ontario, we have been locked down again for another 4 weeks. And regardless of what the law is, regardless of what the purpose is, the basis of the impetus to lock us down is the virus itself. That is the excuse. And so our mission really is to eradicate the virus, and how we do that is through the transfer of this energy. And so we have two different fields. We have the cup number 1, which is emotional, which is stronger, depleting the energy of the virus. We have cup number 2, which is actually smaller, and it is physical. And we not only deplete the energy, but we convert the energy. This is the duality. So we have a depletion and we have a conversion. And this is the advanced part of the science. So the thing about the virus is that it is seeking protein. And so we know the amino acids, which are the building blocks of life, are the beginnings of protein. And how they get to be protein is to start with 3 amino acids, which are the foundation. And then as they grow the DNA, which is a manifestation from the RNA and the combination of the two forces working together. And that's the part of the growth. And then the 4th amino acid comes in and causes a folding over, which is the basis of protein. And then from the protein, we have the creation of water. And so we're looking at our skin, our cells, and how they're created. They have layers. And these layers are also gravitational and magnetical. And in the previous classes, we talked about phospholipids and how they work. And so the phospholipids...
Zoom is open. Our Zoom is not open.
Hello, Mr. Kesh.
Yes. I was going to interrupt you, Alex, because I saw his mic was open and I...
Yes, our Zoom is not connected. The Keshe Foundation Zoom is still hanging. Yes, good day to you. Sorry about that. Just carry on, please.
Okay.
No, I just came in because our Zoom is not connected. Keshe Foundation Zoom, part of the whole Zoom structure, which is down at the moment. We are part of it. It was interesting to see our open. Carry on. Sorry about that.
Mr. Kesh, the Spanish Zoom can be opened. I opened it for a while 2 hours ago.
Yeah, but they have a big problem. They have 46% failure in logging in at the moment in Zoom.
We've had tremendous support from the knowledge seekers here. Everybody's made tremendous efforts to be here, and I thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry about that. It's just that I was surprised that you are on, because the whole of the Keshe Foundation network on Zoom is up, and they keep on telling us try in half an hour, and now they're trying to fix it from the Zoom side.
We have people with private accounts like Alex and Ed who are willing to offer up their number and their passcode for us.
But are you still on a 40-minute or 45-minute time?
No, this is my license. It's my licensed account.
Ah, okay. No problem. We'll see when they bring us up, because they know they're working on it. We are not the only people. A lot of people around the world are affected by it.
Well, that's reassuring news.
Pardon?
Well, that's reassuring news. So
yeah, we know apparently they were upgrading or moving to a new system or whatever they were doing, and they were hoping that during Easter time it will be quiet, they can do it, but somehow there is a mislink in their system. And
good that it's not sabotage then.
Pardon?
I say it's a good thing that it's not a sabotage or something.
No, it's Zoom totally. I don't. If you go on the internet and you put it, yesterday they had 35%, or later on they had 35% failure logging in, and this afternoon raised to 46% failure to log in. And they are talking to our IT group that they are trying to fix it. They asked us to test every 5 minutes or every 30 minutes, sorry. And it's a worldwide Zoom upgrading. You're not the only one. There are, apparently, when you read on the internet, you're reading some people even missed their teaching classes with other groups or whatever. Some conferences has been canceled.
Well, we have been very lucky, and we have been able to continue. And
yeah, it seems individuals are much more successful than organizations. Organizations, universities, and companies are the ones who are hit hardest. But hopefully by Monday, Tuesday, they will sort it out.
And there are people who are paid to do that, and that's a good thing. So,
no, this is the Zoom, because you know, due to Corona has had a lot of new demands on it. I think they were trying to upgrade, and somehow the interface has not worked with the new upgrade. We are on top of it. It's not the sabotage, it's just everybody is in it. It's not just one or two people, a lot of people are. This afternoon was 46% failure in logging in worldwide. We'll see.
Well, we are grateful for what they're doing, and Mr. Kesh, I hope you stick around. I'm almost finished with this presentation.
Yeah, 3rd of April they started. They were hoping to be doing it, but at the moment worldwide have a problem. We had a notification of the upgrading on the 3rd, and when upgraded, everything failed. It's okay, it happens. We have it at the moment with other servers we are moving. So it's just the server companies have to. I'll be here, don't worry, no problem. I was surprised that you managed to get it going, because we have all the meetings till next Wednesday, at least, till we see what Zoom does. Because we have a huge platform of communication with Zoom. So when we saw it first, we got worried that something has happened, but then we checked. It took them nearly 24 hours to reply to us. That's how busy they are. Support usually responds very immediate in Zoom. More than 24 hours before they respond to us that please check again. They think they can bring it up, but we'll see. We're all in it, and it's a good thing to learn.
It certainly is, and it's also demonstrated the tremendous support we've got from all the knowledge seekers. Everyone who's here has had to jump through the hoops, and we've all worked together. It's wonderful to watch.
It is interesting, but it's part of the new technologies, and it taught me a lot of things in past 48 hours. That what happened if Zoom does such a thing one day to us, with the position we have internationally. So the IT team will start looking in the backup. We have to. Once this is sorted with Zoom, we will bring in the backup. In the way we had the Skype, we moved to Zoom, and then we moved to Telegram to back each other up as they run into problem.
Oh, perfect.
We are backing up this. Once this is over with Zoom, we'll bring most probably European company. But we have an organization which is now writing our program. Keshe Foundation is getting its own Zoom teaching written for it as a gift by a nation or a government. They have already, all our education system will go on that new system in the next 2-3 months, which means we become totally independent to teach worldwide. They brought their own program writers. They start writing this for us, and we gradually move on to that. That means no one can bring average Keshe Foundation down. It's a gift by government to the Keshe Foundation. They put their scientists and the programmers to do it.
Is that the same group that did the TV station?
No. It's one of the world top governments. They have operators. They put their own specialists in to do. We're getting a lot of support in the background by a number of nations, governments, organizations. They're all coming in. Let's see what happens. Anyway, sorry to bump in. I didn't know my microphone was open.
I'm glad that you did. You came in at a very appropriate time because I was talking about phospholipids and the communication between the gravitational and magnetical relationship because, you know, how do the cells communicate from getting the information inside to the outside? And so we talked about transition. And so that has to go from the pole. So if we look at the rotating field of the cell boundary, we find that the inside is gravitational and the outside is magnetical, and the cells, the phospholipids, how they've oriented themselves have created a barrier of fields. So there's a plasmatic field here, which is attracting and attracting information because the energy is coming, it's coming in, it's absorbed in, goes around, and it's being emitted. And some of the energy is passing through and it's not sticking around. So this is one cell, but then we have other cells. And so this communication is between, within the cell. It has to be able, the information has to be able to go from inside to the outside somehow. So this is intracellular communication. And this is a basis of communication within. But we look at plasma and it interacts with other fields. And so this is intracellular communication. And it also is a two-way street. And so we find that there's a rotating field inside and there's a rotating field that's outside. It is a rotating field that is part of this transition between the layers on the cell, and then it's a transmission from cell to cell. Transmission from inside to outside, transmission from cell to cell, transition from inside to outside, right? Transition goes through the poles, transmission goes through the rotation. And so we find that this is the basis of communication. We find all of our cells are working together. And this is one of the things that we're finding with the new pain pens. Instead of focusing on the point, we focus on the whole distribution of the energy through the whole thing. And this is the latest revelation within the last 10 days discussing this, because we are not only depleting the energy of the melody, but we're converting the energy into food. And so we find that groups of cells work together. And this is a good thing because we have groups of lungs and we have groups of kidneys and we have groups of livers. And thank God they do this, because especially if you're in a coma or you're brain dead, you know, something is taking care of business. And so this is what we see when there's an interaction between the emotional and the physical fields, which are the two basic fields, the magnetical giver and the gravitational taker. Again, we find the interaction within the cups. They create a magnetical field, then they create a gravitational field. And yes, life is not about looking for the stairway to heaven, and there's no stairway down to hell. It's the stairway to heaven is within, where we are most stable, where we are most complex. That is the gravitational point, that is within. And the most unstable and the most simple is the giving part, and it interacts with other fields until it becomes, again, more stable and more complex. So this is the basis of the interaction of fields, and we can see that the interaction of these fields is based on susceptibility. So when we look at the picture on the left and we see the rotating field of the GANs, where is this energy coming from? and you look at the field on the right, and you say, well, there's a hole in my GANs. And where does that energy come from? And so is it GANs or is it a hole? And what is it? And why is it? And so something is always something as opposed to being something else. And whatever causes that is the susceptibility. So you say, why is the hole there? No, why is the answer? There is a hole there. What you have to look at is the cause of that hole. And the cause of that hole is understanding plasma science. And now through the new communication that we know there's a special communication within our bodies that has existed. There's a special communication within the seashells, and there's a special communication with our nerves, and there's a special communication with the vertical people. So we understand that plasma is a kind of energy, and so when you define plasma, it's a kind of energy state, and it's pretty important, and we see how it's affecting our lives, and we can transition. We can transition from the magnetical to the gravitational. We can also transition from the gravitational to the magnetical. The only way that we can do that is if we are in a plasma state, if we are plasma beings. So we shouldn't grovel in the lowest energy state, which, you know, is focusing on heat and electricity. We are now getting into the light matter, and the light matter connects the principal matter. And what does it connect through? Well, it connects through the dynamic plasma, the dark matter. And this is what we've been discussing today. So not only does it transition from energy state to energy state, but the rate of transfer is higher in the higher energy states. So in other words, when the snail is making its shell, it has to progressively make a bigger shell, because the shell has to grow at the rate that the snail is growing. So obviously, when it's making a bigger home, it's doing a lot more work than it is doing it when it started the shell with a teeny tiny speck, when it itself was teeny tiny. And so we find that through each rotation, it is growing. And as it's growing by many orders of magnitude. And that's just in the physical rules. But in the plasma rules, we find that the energy states increase by at least an order of magnitude, and the higher energy states feed the lower energy states. And so when we're feeding these energy states, we find that we can either increase, which is natural creation, or we can decrease, which is natural decay, or we can just stay like a bump on the log and become catalytic or non-consuming. And so we find that this is the fundamentals of plasma. It absorbs fields, and it is a barrier of fields. So there's a selection, and this selection is based on the ethos of the universe. And we have to take that into account. So the point here we're trying to say is that when we look at the transition to go from a lower state to a higher state, we find that the energy field increases. So to maintain each energy state as we go up, the maintenance of these energy states is a MAGRAV condition, and that MAGRAV condition on each energy state is based on the x-axis, which is the field rotation. But to go from one state to another state is through the energy transition. And as we go higher, there's more. And this is the point. We settle for too little. We settle for our physicality. We need to demand more, and we need to be more. And the only way that we can be more is to do more. And so in the whole process, we're looking for emotional and physical satisfaction, and we have a few universal languages on this planet. And what we want to discuss with you, that is an earthbound or a spacebound thing. Well, it's the old physics. There's a limitation on the speed of light, and there's a limitation on the pole shifting, and we find that we have scientific and spiritual limitations, and we have to really add to the knowledge. And so this is the future that we're looking at. We are in the future. The future is the present. And that's the what we call the post-pandemic, as far as the Keshe Foundation is concerned, as we deliver the new science. But we have to deal with the present. The present still has the old paradigm, and we still have a pandemic that's out of control. And so we have to change the channel. And one of those channels that we're talking about is the Keshe Foundation TV channel, because science needs the soul for the man for peace. And you can't have peace if you don't understand the ethics of the universe. So the ethics of the universe is no longer bound by the limitations of the speed of light, but it involves morality, compassion, and courage. And this is the basis of our plasmatic structure. And once we understand the rules of that, then we can go beyond the basics of our little teeny tiny world and understand the plasma-bound science has no boundary. It is involving the plasma satisfaction through the restoration of our emotional and physical vitality, which will be delivered shortly by the Universal Body Enhancement Spaceship units. And so there we see that now we will have all things in combination. As plasma is interacting, there's a magnetical pushing and pulling, called the magnetical pushing, the gravitational pulling, and the balance of those is a magnetic condition. And so when we look at our souls and we see that if we continue to depend on the energy from this earth, we are limiting ourselves. We have to open up to the energy of the universe, open and yield to the power that comes in and allow it to happen. It is only then that you can receive. In order to do that, you have to provide a pattern. So you have to be discriminatory in what kind of pattern you provide, because when you provide that pattern, you get that energy, and that energy mimics that pattern. So the game, the question is, when we play tic-tac-toe, everybody knows that game, X's and O's. But when you fill up the board, and if you don't fill up the center, then the question becomes, if I have the transmission from left to right, or if I have the transition from bottom to top, and there's another field force, who is the winner? And we're not going to talk about that today. We are just the messengers of peace and friendship. The winner is this planet. We are delivering peace on this planet. It is in public domain. All we ask is that you sign the World Peace Treaty, once with your pen, once with your heart, restore some physical and emotional harmony and vitality to yourself, to your neighbor, and to this planet. As knowledge seekers, we all came to this meeting to a difficult course today. Thank you all for being here. As knowledge seekers, we are really truth seekers, but that's not enough. That is not enough. You can be a bump on a log, and you can do quite well. Can we become difference makers? We understand that this plasma state is not only within us, but it's throughout the rest of the universe. This is a universal language, and the plasma science needs to be delivered in exchange for peace on Earth. That is the lesson. We made it, Mark. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Alex. You're providing the room number plus the teaching. Where would we be without you? I want to thank you very, very much. I had a question. You've seen this formula around the foundation where gravitational fields minus magnetical fields equal your structure. Is that a valid formula? Would you say?
If the gravitational and magnetical fields are physical only. So when we look at the new math, we have to understand that there's a plasmatic component in that. So when we looked at the structure, let's say of the neutron, it has its physical thing. So we look at the mass of the electron and proton of the neutron, that component. But we also have to look at the mass of the antimatter, dark matter, and matter. And then we also have to look at the mass of the PMTIX, the transition energy. And we take all of that into account because that is all part of the plasmatic manifestation. It is the plasmatic manifestation which is the substructure for the physical manifestation. So our physical manifestation ends up being a maggrav, which is the balance between the gravitational and the magnetical. And so that is the gross. So what you're talking about is the net. And the net is the plasmatic energy, which has been consumed in the process, because we have to decrease the energy to get into the physicality. And where does that energy go? It has to retain itself in the plasmatic condition, because it is the substructure for the physicality. So yeah, you're correct. If you take the difference of the gross energy, the totality, and subtract the physicality, you would get the plasmatic condition. But understand that the plasmatic condition is not mathematically minus the physical condition, because part of the plasmatic energy contributes to the physical. Okay, so the position of the physical is determined and predetermined by the plasmatic condition, and the energy that the plasmatic condition gets is based on its position between what? Between whatever. And this is the essence of the plasma science. So what I'm answering you is a question based on my knowledge, which is limited. But the advanced science, which is unlimited, and there are people who understand this, can, you know, explain it further. This is the course that we are going to be proceeding on. Yes, please carry on.
Well, if I had 100 plasmas in my structure, and I want to give you, Alex, 20 plasmas. If I give you the 20 plasmas, then my structure is only 80% of what?
No.
No?
No. If I give you my knowledge, do I leave a hole in my head? If I give you my knowledge,
No.
whatever it is, you know, if I have $100 and I give you $20, I'm left with $80. But if I give you my knowledge, did I lose knowledge?
No.
That's
No, but
same.
I'm thinking, do you give it, I'm just thinking of this giving first, or do you accumulate like the neutron? It doesn't divide until it absorbs more energy to the ability to shoot off an electron and a proton, let's say. So, and in space, beings take the fields that they need and they give the fields that they don't need to maintain, I would say, their structure.
That's right. So going back to the creation of the nerve cell, your body was created before you were born, right? You didn't have a real play in that, shall we say, from a conscious standpoint. It's after you were born, after a certain period of time, you became conscious. At that point in time, you start building up the DNA from its originating position. You know that there was a DNA as part of it because the combination of the DNA and the RNA derives from the origination of the amino acid. And so when your amino acid comes in from the origination of your soul with the interaction of this environment. So that becomes the amino acid. The codification for the amino acid is based on the relationship between the RNA and the DNA, at which point they would be basically the same. So now you come into life, shall we say, life as physicality on this planet. Now you start adding to the knowledge. In order to add to that knowledge, when you look at the nerve construction, there's a rotating field. And so the myelin sheath grows around your nerves. And as the myelin sheath grows, it grows the same way the shell from the snail grows. And it's a cornucopia. It keeps growing and it gets bigger and bigger. Why? Because you are learning and this knowledge is coming in. And in order for you to retain this knowledge, and this knowledge is coming in at the speed of light and it doesn't slow down, the speed of light that it comes in is the speed of light on this planet. Okay, but it doesn't slow down. You can't slow it down. You just have to extend the path. So what you do is you extend the path to the field rotation. But if you go through around once, you come back to the same spot. Now what do? Now you have another energy that's coming into the same spot. Oh, no. You can't have two energies at the same spot. Okay, one has to move. And so where does it move? Well, it moves to another level. And that's called learning. And so it keeps rotating and rotating and rotating. So when you start to learn more, you have to be able to absorb more. And so there has to be some kind of manifestation that you can do that. You cannot maintain that physically. We see that with our computers. We see that with the network that's been crashing this weekend. Physically, we can't handle it. There are limitations. There are numeric limitations. There are communication limitations. When we get into the plasma science, we are not limited by that. The method of transition of energy is the same, but the retention of the energy through the field forces is it's different in its construct, okay, because it doesn't have that physical limitation. So we see, well, I haven't seen it. I've heard stories of it, okay? So we see, spaceships that are small, and we see spaceships that go right across the sky. So what is the limitation of that? You see planets that are Earth size, smaller than Earth, larger than Earth. What causes that? And how do they maintain them? And so you find that there has to be a positioning between the magnetical and gravitational force field with relationship to what? So within the solar system, if we're talking about the planets, it's within a relationship of the gravitational force field of the sun and the outer edges of this solar system, which is the transitional range. So we find that the planet Mercury travels through a certain field, Venus travels through a certain field, Earth travels through a certain one, Jupiter and Saturn and so on. They all travel through various fields, and the manifestation of these planets is based on the field strength at that point, because in terms of physicality, all those planets that I talked about are in physicality, but the substructure is in a plasmatic reality. And that plasmatic substructure is the same, whether it's Earth or Jupiter or Saturn, because it's within the range of the solar system, which is governed by the core, which is the sun. But the manifestation of the physicality is based on the transition of the field strength between the gravitational point being the sun and the magnetical sphere of the outer limit. And then that is one context, that is one range, and that range is part of the galaxy. And our galaxy is the Milky Way, and then that is part of another. And so it's a part of a part of a part of a part. And so from our point of view, what we're seeing is visible, is tangible, it's physical. But what we're not seeing is the non-physical, non-tangible, and non-visible. And this is the substructure.
Just like with a Maggrav coil, it has so much energy in it, but it won't absorb any more until you start to drain from it. Correct? You need a sink on it to make it to start to work. But I'm just thinking of these.
No, but it's in a balance. It's in a balance. So you can't stop the energy. So to maintain that balance, energy is coming and going, but the net, what you're talking about, the net energy flow, It is strictly a catalyst. The MAGRAP position is strictly a catalyst. Energy is coming and going. There is no consumption. There is no growth. But if you start to drain that energy has to be replaced, right? Or
Right,
the
but it-
MAGRAP condition will collapse.
So is it better to give first or to accumulate first and then give to maintain the structure? That was my basic question. Or does it
Well,
work
that is
both
that is
ways?
the right question. You see, that is the right question, because in order to receive, you have to give. So that is the right question.
So then that old saying, it's more blessed to give than to receive, doesn't apply. Does it?
Yeah, it does. But the giving that we're giving, the way that is attributed to is our physicality. You know, oh, we like to give presents out at Christmas. What about the other 364 days of the year? Hey, you know what? I'm taking for those other 364, so maybe I can have a little bit left over on Christmas Day that I can give to someone who I supposedly care for. That's so phony and fake. You know, you cannot be insincere to yourself. You can't. You can't lie to yourself. You always know the truth. You lie to others, or you're insincere to others, and you think you fool them. I'm not talking about you specifically. You understand? This is just a general context. But you know, we think, oh, we'll just sweep it under the carpet. Nobody knows. Well, if nobody knows and you know, that means you're a nobody. And you're, you know, what did they say in the commercial? Everybody's a somebody. Okay, and that's the whole point. Nothing is nothing. There's something that's always something, as opposed to being something else. So if you have no ethics and no morality, guess what? You're locked down. And we're not just locked down because the governments have locked us down. We are locked down because we are delinquent in our relationships. We are delinquent in our actions. And the whole benefit, the whole, what do you call it? The dividend. We have a peace dividend, we have a corona dividend, okay? Because it's showing us how life works. And what is very interesting is that the whole purpose of eradicating the virus was for our problem on this planet. It was for the problem in outer space. And so the reason for that is because we are not designed to handle it properly. What constitutes handling it properly? So what is the virus? The virus is an energy pack. And this energy pack is seeking a gravitational home. And so it'll use us as the gravitational home. If we are not sophisticated enough to deal with it and convert that energy. So there's two ways to convert it. One is through depletion, and the other is through conversion. And when we convert that energy, then we understand that we can convert that energy to a food. So really, the delivery of viruses within the universe is actually an energy delivery system. And so when we are looking at our particular configuration, there's no compatibility with this delivery system. So, you know, it's like going to a restaurant and you say, well, you know, I want a meal, and then, you know, they bring you 100 meals. Well, you know, you'd just be overflowing with your abundance, and it would be a tremendous waste. Well, the universe doesn't work like that. You only get what you need. And you get as much as you need, but you only get what you need. You don't get any more. And the reason for that is because you have to give. If you want more, you have to give more. And so you become a facilitator, a co-communicator, a co-creator, a procreator. This is the point. This is the whole essence of energy transmission and energy transition. And our skill in being able to do this is how we become more skillful at plasma science. And we are just at the beginnings here. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is to give a basis of understanding to try and bridge between the old science and the new science, and to go through all this gobbledygook of the spirituality and understanding how the spirituality works and how to figure out how the science works. And, you know, I don't know about you, but when I talk to scientists, invariably we come to the point and the answer is, I don't know. And that's not acceptable. So we have become a race where we are settling for the lowest common denominator. And the lowest common denominator is of the lowest energy level. So it's not a matter of showing off or bragging or whatever. It's a matter of our evolution. And so through the knowledge that we gain, it extends our DNA. And so when we transition to another state, we take the combination again of the RNA, which we came with, and the DNA, which we've added to, and take the combination of the two. And so you could say that the RNA is the spiritual and the DNA is the scientific, and you combine those two, and we take this as a plasmatic knowledge and we go through and the rest of the universe. And what is really most exciting about this is because when we're turning the world upside down, we are advanced creatures because we can not only transmit spiritually, but we can transition physically. And we're not the only ones that can do this. There are others who can do that and transition back spiritually. All right. So this is what we have to advance to. And why do we need to advance to that? Is because this limitation and what attracted us here in the first place is the elimination of this limitation. We want to eliminate this limitation because we are in heaven. Our earth is heaven. This is a heavenly place, and we need to preserve it. The reason we're here is the earth has called us. We are answering a call. We are the answer.
Well, I guess I've been using the term matter state rather loosely then. In the last workshop, Mr. Kesh indicated that we're not in the matter state. A rock or a stone is in the matter state, but we're a dynamic plasma. And I was always, I was always, he said your bones are the closest thing to the matter state within the body. And even that is a dynamic thing going on. But didn't we talk about the concrete also being growing?
Exactly.
Moving?
Exactly.
So the concrete's not in the matter state either?
Exactly.
Oh, very interesting. But anyway, I think I was using that term rather loosely, of matter state, thinking as these beings that we are, we're in the matter state, but we're not at all. We're a very powerful dynamic plasma. And
yes.
I need to address that.
Well, you have 7 billion people on this planet who need to redress that. The one thing that you do know is that the essence of their RNA already has that knowledge. And so there has to be a link between that knowledge on the unconscious level and the consciousness. And the physicality will never violate the universal laws of the universe. It will just not do that. That it doesn't work because energy is always in motion and you can't stop it. But what you can do is disconnect from that. And so this disconnection is different from detachment. Detachment seems to have a connotation of disconnection. No. Detachment is an easement of the emotional baggage. And so to not carry the emotional baggage, shall we say physically, You just don't acknowledge it. You just disconnect from it. No man would kill another man if they were connected properly to their soul, because that emotional baggage is really hard to handle. It causes a lot of pain.
Well, I was glad to hear
And-
that the Zoom was just an updated issue or a rebuilding on their part, rather than, I was thinking sometimes they take the whole airline down just to get one or two passengers, and who cares about the rest, as we've seen in the past, like with the Malaysian incident. But apparently it's just a general.
Yeah, but there is a, there is there's a problem with Facebook simultaneously. So, it may not be that cut and dried. The point of the matter is that there are limitations on our freedoms. So no soul wants to be a slave, and no soul carries abuse. And so this is the ethos of the universe. And we as knowledge seekers, we need to become more aware about that. And then we have to figure out, what are we going to do with that awareness? Okay. This becomes a dilemma, because knowledge imbues responsibility. And a lot of people don't want to assume the responsibility. We're not bragging, but to get this meeting together, you and I spent several hours working the bugs out, and then with the help of a whole army of knowledge seekers, made this meeting possible today, right? That's what it takes. That's when the knowledge seekers become proactive. That's what it takes to make things happen. When we realize that we have that power, really realize, and then we take the responsibility to make that happen, then you understand the context of the meaning of the last man standing, because each of us individually are the last man standing. And then collectively, we are the last man standing, if you know what I'm saying.
Yes, I noticed in the participants list, there's some new names here. Now that may be because of the outage and all, and we know who Smart Computer is, I think. And we know who S is because she posted in the chat. But I was wondering if any of the other ones that we don't recognize, like Maggie ORO, or there was another one, would introduce themselves to us. IGG92, IGG92, if you can hear me, would you open your mic and tell us where you're from or your name? And there was another one, Yahoo. I don't see it right now. I was just wondering who was with us today. Okay, no problem. Would anyone else like to ask a question or share some knowledge with us today? We do have 49 participants here. I think Mr. Kesh will come back in a moment or two, hopefully.
Mark, Alex, when you started answering Mark's question, you said when you're born, but isn't it when you're conceived, your soul starts building your physical body inside the womb?
Yes, for sure. I was using the born aspect as one of the transition zones. But yes, you're 100% correct. Yes, Jonathan, and I appreciate you bringing up that point, because that is something a lot of people don't understand. The way we describe it, obviously, is that we were a glint in Daddy's eye, right?
John, were you a glint in your daddy's eye?
I surely was. I think the majority of us were. I don't know if the males really wanted the glint or not, but we're here.
Right. Who's the hunter and who's the hunted, as he had explained to us when you go out, or the apple example. Is it the apple in the refrigerator calling to you, or is it you calling to the apple? Or when you go out and hunt, are you the hunter or are you the hunted?
Well, it all depends on if you call it magnetical or gravitational. You're irradiating magnetical, but the gravitation is pulling from the other side, isn't it?
The knowledge is quite deep. Would anyone else like to come in here? Please feel free. We're all knowledge seekers, or possibly just guests, but we can all share knowledge or whatever you'd like to bring up.
Hello, it's Salomea. I have a question for Alex. I didn't understand quite well the relation between the DNA and pH of the blood.
Oh. Yes.
And yes, the telomeres, or I don't know. I don't know if you didn't speak about telomeres, but you said something about perpendicular, and maybe we can see these slides and remember.
Yeah, let me try and get that slide up.
Yeah.
But this is an interesting subject because, again, it talks about the limitations.
Thank you very much.
I think I'm getting there. We've all gone through a lot of technical learning today that we need to learn how to do this better. Oh yeah. This is what you're asking about. Actually, this. So this is a fact. If you look at the DNA under a microscope and you see that there is a change in the way. If you look at the DNA as a sine wave, and if you look at it as two sine waves together, and so what are these sine waves doing? They're creating like a ladder, but it's a wavy ladder. And so sometimes we only think about communication along the line. So let's say if you have two codons on the red line, and you say, well, the interaction of the field is just along the red line. That's one direction. But there's a red line and a yellow line, and so there's an interaction of the field there. But then there's also a distance, a gap between the red line going up and the red line coming down. So it's kind of like if you look at one peak of the red line, that would be like a mountain. And if you look at a peak and then on the other side, then that's another mountain. And to go from peak to peak is a range. And so the gap between there, well, we might have a valley. And so we can go through the mountain to go from one side to the other. And then we can go through the valley to go from one side to the other. And then back to the mountain, then go through again. And so this is transmission. We somehow can go through all of these things to get to the other side. So that's one way to communicate. If we can't go through, then we have to follow the red line, okay? So, and we may have to get to the other side by leaving the red line, going to the yellow line, going through, and then coming back. These are all possibilities. But as the pH changes in terms of our physicality, the DNA extends. Well, this causes a change in the field strength. This causes a change in the communication. And we know this for a fact. So if you look at the DNA of a healthy person, you'll see a nice squiggly line. And if you look at the DNA of a deceased, the DNA will be flat. And this is what they call flatlining. And they just show that on an oscilloscope in the hospital room when your heart stops beating. And so when it stops beating, and it's flatlining. But it's the same thing. Your DNA flatlines also. And so we know that there's a range. There's a range between the flat line and we know this between the curvy line. And so there's in between. And so this in between the healthy and the death we call unhealthy. And how unhealthy are you? Well, you can, the body has a tremendous resiliency. So obviously, most of us are not completely healthy. And this is part of what we call aging. And so in terms of a physicality, what you're referring to as the telomere, and you understand my knowledge is limited, but what I will tell you is the understanding of the telomere is that every time a cell is created, or shall we say replaced, which is what happens to our cells, obviously a certain portion of our cells gets replaced and regenerated. Not all the cells get regenerated at the same time, which is how we maintain our MAGRAV condition. But as these replacement cells come in, they seem to have discovered that the telomere shortens. So in other words, every time a cell gets reborn or recreated or replaced, the telomere shortens by, say, a unit of 1. And so they have apparently quantified the number of telomeres in a cell and determined the maximum age of a person. So in other words, when you're born with the maximum number of telomeres, and then when you die, your telomeres are no longer able to replicate. So this is a physical explanation of what is happening in the plasmatic basis. But when we look at RNA, the RNA is the original transcription. As John said, we were talking about, when you get born, and you talk about the glint in daddy's eye, if you will. So this RNA has a transcription, and it is basically constructed the same way as the DNA, but it is perpendicular to the RNA. And so we find that there's an interaction between the RNA and the DNA. And we reference the RNA as maternal and the DNA as paternal. And the reason we say that is because the RNA is the birth of the child, if you will, is in the womb of the mother. That's how we understand it at this point in time. So that would be based on the RNA, because you have no physical experience. You have no life experience. You have no life interaction with the physicality of this environment of this earth. So the RNA and the DNA at that point would interact, but they would be the same. In other words, the composition of the RNA and DNA would be the same because that is the origin of the creation of our physical manifestation. From that point on, we have an interaction with this environment. And so this environment not only involves the growth within the womb, but also the growth within this planet, which is also rotating and interacting with the sun and the other planets. And how much do we take into account? Well, for our purpose of discussion, we're just going to take the DNA interaction into account to our presence on this planet. And so one of the things that we found with the plasma science is its capability to restore energies. So in other words, we can take, let's call it genetic modification. And if we take a seed from a plant and we, shall we say, prepare it in a plasma water, we find that it will not pick up the regeneration, right? We're saying the seed is the regeneration for the next plant. The seed was created by the old plant, and it becomes the new seed for the new plant. So based on the discussion with the telomere, the new seed would deliver a message based on the termination of the old plant. Well, in the plasma science, the beginning of the new seed is based on the origination of the seed. So we find the reversal of the gene modification because the gene modification is done on a physical basis. And the plasma science is a manifestation of the plasmatic basis. So the plasma feeds the lower energy. So the plasma manifestation, the plasma reality is of a higher energy state than the physical reality. So where do you pick up with the regeneration? Do you pick it up from the physical manifestation or do you pick it up from the plasmatic manifestation? So with the plasma science, we have a restoration. We don't pick it up from the telomere, we pick it up from the originator. The origination of the DNA is actually, at the beginning, is methionine, which is based on iron. And so we find that the main component of our blood is iron. And so this, opens up the whole vista of the understanding of the health sciences and the relationship there. But the interesting thing is that when we look at the composition of the blood, we don't see the physical iron. So the iron becomes basically plasma iron. And so from a health standpoint, we have a passing confirmation to our plasmatic origin. So the doctor knows that there are babies. They don't really know where these babies come from, except that they deliver them from the womb. So that's the part where our physical science picks up. It picks up from the transition from the womb to the physical state. And what the plasma science picks up is from the origination of the soul into the physical state. This is fantastic because we now have the capability of killing one of the worst phrases in the English language is when we use old and decrepit in the same sentence. You can be young and decrepit, or you can be old and vital, have vitality. And the plasma science gives us the opportunity to be old with vitality. Now imagine this. So you have your RNA knowledge, which is the essence of your physicality. And then you have the DNA interaction, which is the essence of the experience in this environment, which is added to the knowledge. And so, you know, when you give the opportunity for people to say, well, you know, when you look into your life and see, you know, when were you the happiest in your life? You know, when you were, you know, 13, you know, when you were 19, 25, 39, when were you the happiest, you know? And would you like to go back there again? Yeah, I really wouldn't mind being young again, but gee whiz, I sure don't want to go stupid again because I was really stupid when I was young. And you can say that because we're all smarter now than when we were before. That's one of the byproducts of growing. That's one of the byproducts of having experience. Our experience teaches us, and that's what life is. Life is for learning. So we now have an opportunity not only for learning and benefiting from that learning, but we also have an opportunity of extending our life, and more importantly, the quality of our life. What kind of quality is where you live in a nursing home and you're locked down because of the coronavirus? I mean, you really can't even do anything. You're locked in your room. And then some people pay a pretty penny to be locked in the room. There's no quality of life. So what the plasma science is restoring the quality of life and the opportunity for us to have a quality of life. And how can you have a quality of life when you're constantly limiting all the possibilities? So let's get real. Let's get rid of the possibilities, of limitations on the possibilities, and expand and become possibility generators. And one of the things that we can do is restore our health, emotional, and physical vitality to that of our youth. And then what? Then be what? Irresponsible again? No. No, we have to be responsible. We have to mature. We have to deliver peace on this planet because the work is not done. And we're not alone in that wanting. We want it as a humanity. The earth wants it as a being, as a physical being in the solar system. And the universal community also wants it because no one wants to hang around with a hooligan. So the future is very, very exciting. I'll give you an example, one more example, if I could, please. They were doing a science experiment on certain lions or tigers, I can't remember which. And they couldn't tell the difference. And so they decided to tell the difference by the markings on the body. And then they looked at how the animals exchanged information and how they communicated. And they looked at the notes that they took and they said, well, I know this guy, he has a black ear and a white ear. And then this other guy, he has 2 spots on his tail. And another guy, he has another marking on his hind leg. And you look at the way the animals communicate, they don't look at the tail or the hind leg. They look into the eyes of the companion animal. They look at the face. They communicate face to face. They don't need the markings on the body to tell who they're talking to. They know perfectly well. So the scientists who were doing this study scrapped the whole system and they said, you know, well, we have to look at the face. We can't see the fur on the face. We have to look past the fur. The fur is just a physical covering. You know, that's one of the things that we're using with clothing. We don't just use the clothing to keep us warm, but we also use it to hide our identities and hide our true nature. It becomes a stealth maneuver. It's really a sad course of activity. So when we're dealing with the plasma science, don't look at the physicality, look at the soul. Understand who you're talking to, understand what the intentions are. And, you know, when you have that capability, then it's a lot easier going through life because then you don't become a victim of the abuse and the deceit that goes along, and you see the truth. And if that's what you want to exchange your energy with, then that shall be. And we get to choose what we want to exchange our energy with. So that is all part and parcel of the growing. The growing is all part and parcel of it. This is when I became exposed to this, all I just wanted to do was get rid of my wife's cancer. And I did. And then I had to learn about how life worked. Well, I wasn't ready for that. That was not, I didn't sign on for that. I just like, get rid of my cancer and that would be great. And then you have to find out what the rest of the story is. And it's been an exciting journey. And the nice part about it is that we're still only at the beginning of this journey. And now we have what I call the dividend from the knowledge that we're gaining, the learning part. We're learning about what's working and what's not working. And so the new knowledge is opening up that possibility. Didn't mean to ramble, but this is just this is part of the class today. This is how our DNA is affected when we create a sick planet. It becomes acidic, and our DNA responds. That's all. Very simple. It cannot hang on to its energy, and it starts to release and relax and expand. At that point, we have a disruption of communication. And we all know how detrimental disruption of communication is. So the new science is going to show us a new way to communicate, the way the animals communicate, the way the planets communicate, and the way the universe communicates, and actually the way the Creator communicates with us. Very exciting times. Thanks so much. Beautiful question. Thank you.
Misty writes in the chat, does this explain our subliminal messages from our right side of the brain to the left? I would assume she's talking of RNA and DNA, but Misty, if you'd like to restate that or add to that, please feel free to open your mic.
I was wondering if it was the subconscious rather than unconscious, more than subliminal, but the underthoughts being subconscious. That comes through, like when you think of somebody and they call you, or do you understand?
Yeah, Misty, you know what? The subconscious and unconscious is actually the same thing.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, because the unconscious is not something, you're either conscious or you're unconscious. And so the subconscious is the construct, is the substructure for the consciousness. So the construct of the subconscious is the plasmatic reality, is the plasmatic construct. And the consciousness is the manifestation of the physical reality. Right? So interestingly enough, what we do know is that when we go to sleep, we leave the consciousness behind, if you will, because the consciousness is preoccupied with maintaining our physicality, maintaining our face, if you will, so that when we wake up in the morning, we have a place to go to, and we know where to go, right? Because there's a connection, and that connection is subconscious, right? And then the interesting part, of course, is, well, what goes on while we're sleeping? And unfortunately, there are people on this planet who believe that if you, say, sleep for 8 hours, which is a third of your day, that's a waste of time. But truth of the matter is, allowing your soul to travel without the burden of the physicality, you become more effective, because as you go into the higher energy state, you become more effective by many orders of magnitude. And so those 8 hours are not 50% of the rest of your day. Though that third of the day that you're sleeping, you're probably doing, for a mathematical discussion, 10 days worth of preparation for your physicality. And so you find that in the 10 to 14 day period is sometimes when your physicality manifests into something that you were thinking about a couple of weeks ago. Because preparation is always done in advance. And that's how you do that. So your soul is never going to guide you into the wrong place, because your soul is your friend, your soul is you. But it's how we interpret that. And if we want to interpret the soul as being an inconvenience that takes away 30% of our daily activity, okay, well, that's your limitation. But if we look at the benefit that we get from our soul travel, and we understand the divine is the builder, then we just have to ask ourselves the right question. What are we building? What are we creating? And we understand the destruction and creation are actually the same thing. And we find that when we build something, it takes a lot longer than it does to destroy something. So we have to have care, compassion, respect, and understand the ethos of the universe and behave accordingly. And we don't need police force and man-made laws to tell us how to operate. The universal law has provided us with everything that we need and has delivered that. If you want to talk about physical manifestation throughout our DNA. And from that we add to our DNA, that's the knowledge. And so the knowledge adds to that. That's another great question. Thanks.
Thank you.